So what are the Russians and Ukrainians up to in their war again? Ukrainian drones attacked St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region. In addition, they also attacked other regions in Russia, such as Krasnodar. This is another new attack. So what happened? What happened is that the Ukrainians effectively opened the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the so-called Russian Davos, and at the same time, the Ukrainians also ended it. It's very symbolic. It's a very strong gesture that says, we're here, the war exists, your air defense is pathetic, and we decide what starts, when it starts, and how big the fireworks will be. It's a very symbolic gesture, which of course also has some strategic and tactical background. And now let's take a closer look at it. So what actually happened? What happened was that the Russians had an economic forum. On the 3rd, the Ukrainians launched a drone attack. And what's probably most interesting about it is that 3 days later, on the 6th, they managed to do it again. On Saturday, they managed to attack in exactly the same place and were quite successful. What does quite successful mean? Quite successful means that they managed to penetrate over both the St. Petersburg and Krasnodar regions, but mainly the St. Petersburg area, and they managed to strike again. The Ukrainians, of course, say that they managed to hit fuel, that they managed to hit ships, that they managed to hit infrastructure, that they managed to hit everything. They would love to say that they managed to hit Putin's toilet, although Putin wasn't there. Simply put, the Ukrainians say they hit everything. The Russians, on the other hand, say that the Ukrainians didn't hit anything at all, that the attack was completely pointless, that there were 0 casualties, that nothing happened to anyone, that it was just ridiculous, that the Ukrainians shouldn't have even tried it, and by sending those drones there, they actually hurt themselves. If I exaggerate a bit, that's basically what each side is saying. But the fact is, we have verifiable photos and videos that show and prove that the Ukrainians did hit something. These photos show and prove that we have footage of thick black smoke rising from the Kronchik base. We have drones here that are clearly visible right above St. Petersburg. We clearly have some recorded damage here, so it's not possible to say that nothing happened, that nothing flew over, or that nothing was hit. They probably hit something because drones that have been shot down would never produce such thick black smoke. This is probably coming from some burning fuel, burning ammunition, or burning oil. Something that burns for a long time. It's not just a small tank of gasoline or fuel for the drone itself. Yeah, so in this regard, those Russian claims that nothing happened are completely off. Sure, this time the Ukrainians probably didn't manage to hit another important military ship, like when they previously managed to hit the Steregoshchi-class corvette in dry dock, which was there for repairs and maintenance. And considering how destructively they managed to hit it, and we can see that both from the video and from the satellite images, which I'm showing you right now, so you can check out the video directly if you're listening. Hello? So we can see that the damage is significant, that there were several firefighting teams involved, and that at the very least, if that ship ever returns to sea, it's going to stay in that dry dock for much, much longer than it would have otherwise. Yeah, in this regard, it might seem like a pretty good success, but at the same time, someone could downplay it saying, well, it's just one damaged corvette. But you know what? It's like penny by penny, and it adds up, and in this case, ship by ship, and it turns into a big problem. Because of course you have some kind of repair schedule and a plan for where a ship should be at a certain time, and when a dry dock is blocked by a ship that shouldn't even be there anymore, then that dry dock isn't available for another ship that could come in for repairs and maintenance. So something might get neglected, the chance of a malfunction or increased danger for those ships whose maintenance is delayed can go up. Yeah, these things are connected. On the other hand, the Russians have now managed to get the Novoy back out to sea. A new or renewed restored missile cruiser. So look, one corvette hit but a cruiser launched. So far it looks pretty good. However, even though, let's get back to that attack, that new attack from Saturday, even though the attack probably wasn't as bad and as destructive as the first one, it was still an incredibly dumb symbolic move. because it wasn't just like the first surprise attack that went through Russian territory and hit Petrograd. Yes, St. Petersburg, which, by the way, is more important than Moscow from a logistics perspective, from an economic strength perspective, because after all, it's by the sea. There are those trade routes. And if, for example, the Russians felt a greater danger in the Black Sea regarding the transport of goods, they'd want to route it through the north and probably even further north. But the Ukrainians would probably be able to reach there too, since they managed to reach Petrograd. And they managed to hit Petrograd with those drones across Russian territory, right? Now imagine if they started flying over Belarusian territory or something like that, where it's even harder to detect and even harder to shoot down because the Belarusians are even less vigilant than the Russians themselves. And at this point, it's important to say that Russia's vast territory is in no way helping it. What used to be strategically very, very, very good for Russia because they could retreat kilometers and kilometers back and the enemy would get exhausted advancing through empty, scorched plains is now stabbing them in the back because they have too much territory to be able to cover it with air defense. Yeah, so right now, if you're Ukrainian, you can find a way for those drones to weave through without hitting air defenses and strike St. Petersburg. And you should be able to pull that off once, but they managed to do it with pretty good results twice in a row. That means that during those 3 days, the Russians weren't able to respond properly and couldn't find the route, the gap that the Ukrainians found and used to weave through their air defenses. And even if they managed to find it, the Russians couldn't close it. And that's one of the biggest problems. Or maybe they did manage to find and close it, but then the Ukrainians found another route. So by closing the old route, the Russians actually opened up a new one. In other words, it seems that the Ukrainians still, even though the Russians have already received a clear, loud, and smoke signal supported warning, the Russians can't respond to those Ukrainian attacks in a way that would prevent it from happening again. We'll see how long the Ukrainians can keep getting away with this, how long they can keep finding routes to St. Petersburg, but if they manage to find routes to St. Petersburg permanently so that the Russians couldn't close them in any way, and attacks on St. Petersburg started happening regularly, that would be a huge disaster. A huge disaster for the reputation of Vladimir Putin, who claims that he will provide Russians with security, prosperity, and peace as long as they don't interfere with his power. And this, when you look at the footage, when you look at the photos, when you even look at the reactions of Russians, it definitely doesn't look like the safety and peace for which they should be willing to give up their freedoms. This is a brutal blow to the reputation of that regime, and they will have to do something to restore their reputation. That means they have to perfectly take down any possible future Ukrainian attack or carry out a very harsh retaliation about which they'll say, see what we did to them for trying to attack the jewel of Petrograd. Yeah, but even so, I feel like even if they dropped 10 missiles on Kiev right now, it still wouldn't have the same strategic and moral effect as the fact that the Ukrainians are managing to attack Petrograd, the pearl of the Russian regime, the second most important city after Moscow, and maybe actually the most important city for the Russian regime from a pragmatic point of view. So it's an obvious embarrassment for the Russian regime and for Vladimir Putin himself when the Ukrainians are ending and starting his economic forum, his amazing Davos, deciding when the fireworks will be and how strong the smoke effects will be. It just doesn't look good at all, but at the same time, it can have one more point than just embarrassing the whole Russian regime. And that's the psychological effect on the mind of Vladimir Putin. Because after all, Vladimir Putin doesn't use the internet, doesn't use a smartphone, doesn't watch those videos, doesn't have social media, doesn't know what likes are, doesn't know what shares are. Well, maybe he knows sharing from the Soviet Union days. But basically, he doesn't know these things. They don't reach him. He doesn't get to that cognitive dissonance where his beliefs could clash with reality that's recorded on video or photographed. So he avoids this. But when the Ukrainians attack his hometown, he sees the docks burning in Petrograd, where he grew up, and as a little boy learned how to be a KGB agent. He simply has his heart in that city. It could have an effect. It could cause him to start making mistakes, to start making decisions that are too aggressive, to bomb Kyiv and civilian targets even more, and to stop focusing so much on military targets, to intensify attacks on targets that aren't important for military victory, and by doing so, give the Ukrainians a chance to strengthen the forces that are important for military victory. So it can also have this psychological aspect of warfare where basically Putin loses his cool because they're bombing Petrograd. Of course, it's probably not going to be like he suddenly starts throwing tantrums and raging like crazy like Hitler, but it could just be something that simmers inside him, something that stirs him up a bit, something that starts gnawing at his mind or something like that, and that might not be completely pointless. So that's it. That's just a psychological aspect of this operation. And since we're already talking about drone bombings, let's go to another place, a different place that has nothing to do with St. Petersburg, and that's the south of Ukraine, which is currently occupied by the Russians, specifically the new Russian route leading to Crimea. This route has been closed for buses, and right now there are restrictions on civilian transportation here. Why are there restrictions on civilian transportation there? It's because the Ukrainians are shelling these roads and have them under control using drones. They are also attacking the road that goes from Russia through the Kerch Bridge directly to Crimea, but they have much more reach over the Chonha road directly to Crimea, but they have much more reach. Because the Russians no longer need the routes along the Sea of Azov, and those drones are really able to operate deep inside, so this route is no longer as safe as it used to be. At the beginning of the war, we actually said that the Russians no longer needed the Kerch Bridge because they had a safe route along the Sea of Azov. That's no longer true. The safe route along the Sea of Azov no longer exists. That's already settled. Drones have come in, it's already being bombed. So now the Kerch Bridge is becoming important again when it comes to supplying Crimea. So I'm not saying anything, but things that used to be important and then stopped being important might be starting to become important again. Write to me what you think about this. Do you think the Kerch Bridge will become something that could be targeted again, or will the Ukrainians focus more on the southern route? Personally, I think they will focus more on the southern route, that the Kerch Bridge is really too exposed for now. But once the southern route is so damaged and so closely watched that it can't really be used safely for civilian purposes, not even for civilian purposes, then the Kerch Bridge will start to make a lot more sense again. Right now, it only makes a little sense, but it could start to make much, much more sense. So, to sum it up, the Russians have been humiliated at their economic forum. St. Petersburg was bombed twice in a row, and the Russians couldn't adapt to it. At the same time, there are attacks on the route leading to Crimea, and the importance of the Kerch route is increasing again. We will continue to monitor this, the bombing of St. Petersburg, and the fact that the Ukrainians are starting to gain operational superiority. That's something that half a year ago, maybe a year ago, we could only dream about. And we were rather saying here in a somewhat depressed way, well, the Ukrainians are probably just defending themselves. Hopefully they'll hold out. We have to help them. So now it looks like the Russians are once again starting to get the short end of the stick on the battlefield itself when it comes to who is advancing, who decides where the fighting happens, who can defend themselves, and who is taking losses. And I think that's fairly positive for the prospects for peace, because the more Russians die without any results and the more Russian cities are bombed, the greater the chance that Russia will be pushed to the negotiating table and some kind of peace will be reached that wouldn't be a second Munich. So that's it. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, support this content if you like it with a like, a share, a comment, and of course, write your opinion. If you really like it a lot, you can send some money through QR codes or super thanks from 50 crowns to 50,000, although actually the sky is the limit. So African princes and similar people, I won't object. In any case, the best thing will be if you keep watching the videos, come back next time and have a great time. See you. Bye.